Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. In the proper spirit of Family Sunday, I'm going to start off with a few words to the kids sitting down here on the steps. If you'd like to come down and join me. Everybody here this morning. Crowd. I'm wondering if you have something that's really, really valuable to you. The most precious thing that you have. What is it? Anybody have anything you want to tell us what the most valuable, the most precious thing they have is? Your DS? I'm guessing it's a video game of some sort. What else? Your family. That's a good one. Okay. What else?
My big lovely little dog.
Your dog. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Toy.
Any special toy? Or just all of them?
Kind of like
Venom.
Venom.
That sounds like a good toy.
I know it's Spider-Man.
Oh, okay. It's a Spider-Man. When I was little, one of my uncles gave me a stamp book. Remember what a stamp book is? It's a book that has pictures in it of stamps, and you collect the stamps and you put them in on top of pictures. And I knew this was a very old stamp book and it was very valuable. I'm sure my mother told me, make sure you don't do anything bad with this, put it on the shelf and never touch it. And so that's what I did. I put it on the shelf, I hardly ever even touched it or looked at it. And then my uncle would come sometimes, and he and I would sit and we'd look through it, look at the stamps and look at the pictures. And one time after a while, he asked me, why aren't there any new stamps in this book? I said, well, I know it's really valuable. I wouldn't want to do anything to mess it up. I wouldn't want to change anything. And he said, well, that's kind of the point. Unless you put new things into the book, it never really changes. You're not really keeping up with it. You're not taking care of it the way you're supposed to. It needs to change. You need to add new things to it. So what I want to take as a message for you all today is, whatever is valuable to you, remember, you can't just put it up on the shelf someplace and look at it. You have to use it. Everything that God has given us, you're supposed to use. I'm sure you use yours plenty. Don't take anything that God has given you and just put it up on the shelf. Whatever is precious that God has given to you has to be taken out and used. And make something of it for God's glory. Okay? I'm going to talk to your parents for a little bit, so let's go back to where we were sitting. Brothers and sisters, welcome to our stamp book. Before I get to that, there was a little bit more backstory that needs to come in here, looking at this story and unpacking it, and I hope a different way than it was unpacked last Sunday. One of the glories of Israel, ancient Israel, and of ancient Christianity also, was that they weren't satisfied to just take the stories they got in the Bible and be done with them. You may have noticed this, reading the Bible, reading the stories. When the Bible is done with a character, it pretty much just drops it. You read along, and suddenly you don't hear anything more about these people. You read to the end of the Gospels and the beginning of Acts, and suddenly you don't hear anything more about the apostles. They just disappear from the story. You read on through, for instance, the story of Lazarus. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, toward the end of the Gospel of John. Now we don't know what happens to Lazarus after that. There's one more mention of him just briefly, but he doesn't even have a speaking part. We have no idea where he goes. Well, one thing that Israel did with its stories, and that early Christianity did with its stories as well, because we came out of Israel, was to make up some backstory for these people. To make pious stories, traditions, I hesitate to call them myths or legends, but they're certainly not validated by anything we have in writing, about who these people were, where they came from, what they did, where they went. And so we know from pious legend that St. Thomas, who was doubting Thomas, went to India and started a church there that still has his name. We know that St. James, whether while he was alive or perhaps miraculously after he was dead, went to Spain. And pilgrims still go to Santiago to visit the remains of St. James, which came to be there in one way or another. We know that Lazarus, who disappears from the story that I was saying the word, by tradition became a bishop, and then, ironically in his case, was martyred for the faith. So we know something about these characters. We know where they went. It helps us to flesh them out a little bit, to make them more real to us, to see who they were, and perhaps what they're trying to say to us. And so it's worth it to do that with the story today as well. Who were these servants, these slaves, and what exactly was going on in this story? We need to start first by just getting straight what they were as much as who they were. The Greek word that's used in the original version of the story is doulos, which could mean slave or could mean servant. You'll notice that both of those were in the story in one place or another today. But it doesn't really mean slave or servant in the sense that we understand it today. It doesn't mean slave because this was not necessarily slavery in an agricultural way the way it was in the United States or in much of the Western Hemisphere once upon a time. These were people who got into debt, couldn't pay it off, and so made a deal with the person that they owed the money to work for a certain number of years. They might be given a place to sleep and some food, but no pay. And what they would otherwise have been paid off their debt. They might have been people who were captured in a war, soldiers or other people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and were held until they were either ransomed or until political winds changed and suddenly the other country had more power. People went back and forth in this way. And in some cases, there were large proportions of the population who fell into this category. There were times in Greece when the majority of the populations in some cities were slaves. But they weren't just out there in the fields working. If you're going to have the system where there are people who can pay off debts or people who are captured in wars, you're not just going to get people who are out there working in the fields. You're going to get some people who can read and write, some people who know how to do calculations, some people who have special skills, they're cooks, they're carpenters, or silversmiths, whatever they are. And so it doesn't really make any sense. And our ancestors were smart enough to realize it doesn't make any sense to send all those people out to pick grapes and plant wheat and do whatever else they're going to do. You looked at these people and figured out what their skills were and put them where they could be useful. So if somebody came who could read or write, you might make that person your secretary, or your lawyer, or your accountant. If someone could cook, obviously you made that person your chef. If somebody had other skills, you put people wherever their skills made them fit. And so that's why when we come into this story, we see the master calling these people in and making different kinds of deals with them. Now bear in mind, they're still slaves, whatever the story may say about what they were doing. The master didn't owe them anything. This was nothing that they had done to earn. This is a deal he's going to make with them for a particular reason. And it's important to know what that reason is. You might suppose that if you had a company with 50 or 60 employees and none of them really wanted to work there, you'd wonder how loyal they really were to you. When they're saying, yes, boss, no boss, right away, boss, do they really mean it? Or when your back is turned, is something going to happen that you wouldn't like to have happen? So, what the boss is doing in this case is saying, okay, I'm going to come up with a way to find out whether these guys really are my loyal employees, my loyal servants. So he calls them in and says, I have a deal for you. I'm going to go away for a while, and I want you to hold on to some stuff for me while I'm gone. They didn't earn it. He's not giving it to them. It remains his property. He just wants them to hold on to it while he's gone. So he calls in his lawyer, his accountant, and his security guard, and says, here's some stuff I'd like you to hold on to. And what he gives him is silver bricks. A talent was a big brick of silver that was worth about 15 years' worth of salary. A lot of money. Enough probably to pay off whatever the debt was that any of them owed to him. Probably enough to ransom them back to whatever country they came from, if that's how they got there. So a big amount of stuff being put into their hands as a way of seeing whether they're loyal. Because it would be enough to pay off their debt or pay off whatever else they had to do, you can think, maybe some of them would think, well, I got this, now off I go. The master's gone, nobody's watching. I can go pay off my debt, away I go. Nobody will be the wiser, and I'm done. But if he comes back and finds that they're still there, and they can give an account of what they've done with it, know that they're loyal. But now even that is reading a little bit too much into the story, because you'll notice that what he says is, here's some of my property, I'm going away, see you. And that's pretty much all he says. He doesn't tell them what to do with it. He doesn't tell them when I get back I'm going to expect it to be more than when I left. All he says is hold on to it for me and I'll be back sooner or later. And then he goes away for a long time. Now the lawyer, being wise in the ways of real estate, takes his 5 talents and goes off and buys some apartment buildings, buys some swampland, knowing that the city is going to eventually want to build a new stadium on swampland. The cook, who is wise in the ways of small business, goes off and invests in part of a restaurant because he knows sort of how that business works and kind of what he can expect to get back out of it. Security guard is something different, though. In ancient times, the law, in Israel at least, was that if you buried something that was valuable in a hole in the ground, if someone then came along and stole it from you, you weren't liable for it. But if you just hid it, if you wrapped it up in a piece of cloth and stuck it up on a shelf someplace in your house, and someone came along and stole it, then you were responsible for it. So he's taking the safe way out. He's doing what takes no risk whatever, because he knows that he won't lose anything. Buries it in the ground, he can always go and dig it up. And if somebody else does it first, he's no worse off for it because it wasn't his fault. The other two, the lawyer and the accountant, take a risk. I came back up from Manhattan last night on the train. You see these posters in the Metro-North trains advertising investment opportunities that you can get into. And it's always a big, colorful picture about how much money you're going to make and what this investment is. And there's all that fine print down the bottom. And because it was in the evening and I was sitting on the train right next to one of these posters, I actually read the small print. It showed how much else I had to do on the train last night. One thing they have to tell you is you may lose money. Not only may you not make any money, it's possible you end up with less than you started with. It's taking a risk. You might make something, but you might lose something too. So these two guys take something that isn't really theirs and take a risk with it. And it turns out the risk really pays off. Because when the master comes back and they're able to give their account, he's pretty pleased with what he gets back. I don't know about you, but if I ever got 100% return on my 401k in a couple of years, I'd be pretty pleased too. I'd probably let my stockbroker go back to the country he came from. If I got 80%, if I got 50%, if I got 20% back, I think I would be satisfied. I think the master would have been too. He wasn't looking to make any money on this deal. Recall, he didn't tell him in the first place to go make money for it. All he said was, hold on to this. So whatever he gets back is not just proof of loyalty, but it's sort of gravy on top. So you can see who gets what reward out of this deal. The reward comes to those who take the risk, who understand that although what they have is not theirs, they have been called to do something with it. Not just to bury it in the ground and hide it, but to make something of it. Now, we all are clever people here, and I don't think I need to tell you this is not just a pretty fairy tale about ancient people. This story is about us. I will not unpack in gory detail every bit of how this is us, but I will leave you with 3 pieces of thought that might help us in taking this story away and making something of it. First, it all belongs to God. We didn't do anything to earn it. It's all going back to God. We all indulge now and then. I certainly do, and I will make bold to think that perhaps a few of you have as well, to engage in the happy pursuit of saying, everything I have, I worked for, I worked hard, nobody ever gave me a break, I deserve it all. You can smile at me, but I know you've done it. I've done it too. And there may be some truth in that, in the way that we engage with one another. Maybe the way that we work with each other, in fact, does not involve giving each other enough breaks. But brothers and sisters, the way that we interact with God has been nothing but one break after another. Everything we have, everything we are, everything we will ever be, everything we can imagine comes from God, remains God's, and is given to us in trust. And that comes with pluses and minuses. On the one hand, we run the risk of becoming the owner of the stamp book, which is too precious. We put it on the shelf, we never touch it. We bury it in a hole in the ground because we don't want to lose it. And we know that if we don't do anything with it, we don't risk losing it. On the other hand, it's kind of freeing, isn't it? I don't know if you've had this experience, but I can say from my own personal experience, it can be very easy to spend other people's money. If everything that we have is God's, then the way that we dispose of it is in God's hands as well. We are called to use what God gave us for God's purposes. So it's not really ours in the first place. How we take it, how we use it, all these things come back to us in the way that we account to God for what it is that we've been given. Second, there's really no way we can get around the fact that eventually we're going to have to give it back. There will come a time when we have to account for what it is that we've done with what we've been given. It probably won't come in the form of an exact accounting. It probably won't be in the form of having to say, I produced X percent. The good news, brothers and sisters, is God isn't expecting 100% return. There's no obligation to double what it is that we were given initially. If the master would have been satisfied with 10%, if any of us would be satisfied with 10% return on whatever we invest, surely God will be too. The goal here is not the amount. The goal is the faithful act. It's producing something with what we've been given. So that when God comes back, we can say, I didn't bury it in the ground. In fact, I did do something with it. Here is what I have produced. I had a discussion only this morning with someone in the congregation about how we measure what it is that we are gaining in this work. Happily, brothers and sisters, it's not us who get to decide what counts as gain. It's in the hands of someone who is far more knowledgeable, but also far more charitable than we are, to decide where that gain is. We don't even have to see it. Our faith tells us that it's there in some form. God is at work. If we will only let God be at work in what it is that we do here. And finally, if in fact we will do this, if in fact we will be faithful, we have every expectation that the reward will be far greater either than anything we've been given, and indeed more than anything that we've even been able to imagine. As I say, in the story, these guys are given an enormous amount of wealth. Anywhere from 15 to 75 years worth of their salary. All in one go in silver bricks. We're not given silver bricks, we're given something much more valuable. We're given ourselves, our lives, our creativity, everything that we can do, everything that we do together. All of that stuff. And yet, we're promised that if we will make some small advance on all of that stuff, what we get back will be worth far more than what we've been given. So my prayer is that we'll take this away, see what it is that we've been given. Remember where it comes from. Remember where it's going. And keep in mind that idea that ultimately the one who remains in possession of it, the owner, the source, the one to whom it will go back, is doing far more with us than we can realize, imagine, expect, deserve, if we will only let God do it. Amen. Amen.